The Call of the Canyon by Zane Grey. Chapter 1, Part 1. What subtle, strange message had come to her out of the West? Carley Burch laid the letter in her lap and gazed dreamily through the window. It was a day typical of early April in New York, rather cold and gray, with steely sunlight. Spring breathed in the air, but the women passing along 57th Street wore furs and wraps. She heard the distant clatter of an L train, and then the hum of a motor car. A hurdy-gurdy jarred into the interval of quiet. "Glenn has been gone over a year," she mused. "3 months over a year, and of all his strange letters this seems the strangest yet." She lived again, for the thousandth time, the last moments she had spent with him. It had been on New Year's Eve, 1918. They had called upon friends who were staying at the McAlpin, in a suite on the 21st floor overlooking Broadway. And when the last quarter hour of that eventful, tragic year began slowly to pass with the low swell of whistles and bells, Carley's friends had discreetly left her alone with her lover, at the open window, to watch and hear the old year out, the new year in. Glenn Kilbourne had returned from France early that fall, shell-shocked and gassed, and otherwise incapacitated for service in the army, a wreck of his former sterling self, and in many unaccountable ways a stranger to her. Cold, silent, haunted by something, he had made her miserable with his aloofness. But as the bells began to ring out the year that had been his ruin, Glenn had drawn her close, tenderly, passionately, and yet strangely, too. "Carley, look and listen," he had whispered. Under them stretched the great long white flare of Broadway, with its snow-covered length glittering under a myriad of electric lights. Sixth Avenue swerved away to the right, a less brilliant lane of blanched snow. The L trains crept along like huge fire-eyed serpents. The hum of the ceaseless moving line of motor cars drifted up faintly, almost drowned in the rising clamor of the street. Broadway's gay and thoughtless crowds surged to and fro, from that height merely a thick stream of black figures, like contending columns of ants on the march. And everywhere the monstrous electric signs flashed up, vivid and white and red and green, and dimmed and paled, only to flash up again. Ring out the old, ring in the new. Carley had poignantly felt the sadness of the one, the promise of the other. As one by one the siren factory whistles opened up with deep, hoarse bellow, the clamor of the street and the ringing of the bells were lost in a volume of continuous sound that swelled on high into a magnificent roar. It was the voice of a city, of a nation. It was the voice of a people crying out the strife and agony of the year, pealing forth a prayer for the future. Glenn had put his lips to her ear. "It's like the voice in my soul." Never would she forget the shock of that, and how she had stood spellbound, enveloped in the mighty volume of sound no longer discordant, but full of great, pregnant melody, until the white ball burst upon the tower of the Times building, showing the bright figures 1919. The new year had not been many minutes old when Glenn Kilbourne had told her he was going West to try to recover his health. Carley rose out of her memories to take up the letter that had so perplexed her. It bore the postmark Flagstaff, Arizona. She reread it with slow, pondering thoughtfulness. West Fork, March 25th. Dear Carley, it does seem my neglect in writing you is unpardonable. I used to be a pretty fair correspondent, but in that, as in other things, I have changed. One reason I have not answered sooner is because your letter was so sweet and loving that it made me feel an ungrateful and unappreciative wretch. Another is that this life I now lead does not induce writing. I am outdoors all day, and when I get back to this cabin at night I am too tired for anything but bed. Your imperious questions I must answer, and that must, of course, is the third reason why I have delayed my reply. First you ask, don't you love me any more as you used to? Frankly, I do not. I am sure my old love for you before I went to France was selfish, thoughtless, sentimental and boyish. I am a man now, and my love for you is different. Let me assure you that it has been about all left to me of what is noble and beautiful. Whatever the changes in me for the worse, my love for you at least has grown better, finer, purer. And now for your second question. Are you coming home as soon as you are well again? Carley, I am well. I have delayed telling you this because I knew you would expect me to rush back East with the telling. But the fact is, Carley, I am not coming just yet. I wish it were possible for me to make you understand. For a long time I seem to have been frozen within. You know when I came back from France I couldn't talk. It's almost as bad as that now. Yet all that I was then seems to have changed again. It is only fair to tell you that as I feel now, I hate the city. I hate the people, and particularly I hate that dancing, drinking, lounging set you chase with. I don't want to come East until I am over that, you know. Suppose I never get over it. Well, Carley, you can free yourself from me by one word that I could never utter. I could never break our engagement. During the hell I went through in the war, my attachment to you saved me from moral ruin, if it did not from perfect honor and fidelity. This is another thing I despair of making you understand. And in the chaos I've wandered through since the war, my love for you was my only anchor. You never guessed, did you, that I lived on your letters until I got well? And now the fact that I might get along without them is no discredit to their charm or to you. It is all so hard to put into words, Carley. To lie down with death and get up with death was nothing. To face one's degradation was nothing. But to come home an incomprehensibly changed man, and to see my old life as strange as if it were the new life of another planet, to try to slip into the old groove, well, no words of mine can tell you how utterly impossible it was. My old job was not open to me, even if I had been able to work. The government that I fought for left me to starve or to die of my maladies like a dog, for all it cared. I could not live on your money, Carley. My people are poor, as you know. So there was nothing for me to do but to borrow a little money from my friends and come West. I'm glad I had the courage to come. What this West is, I'll never try to tell you, because loving the luxury and excitement and glitter of the city as you do, you'd think I was crazy. Getting on here in my condition was as hard as trench life. But now, Carley, something has come to me out of the West. That, too, I am unable to put into words. Maybe I can give you an inkling of it. I am strong enough to chop wood all day. No man or woman passes my cabin in a month. But I am never lonely. I love these vast red canyon walls towering above me. And the silence is so sweet. Think of the hellish din that filled my ears. Even now, sometimes, the brook here changes its babbling murmur to the roar of war. I never understood anything of the meaning of nature until I lived under these looming stone walls and whispering pines. So, Carley, try to understand me, or at least be kind. You know they came very near writing "Gone West" after my name, and considering that, this out West signifies for me a very fortunate difference. A tremendous difference. For the present, I'll let well enough alone. Adios. Write soon. Love from Glenn. Carley's second reaction to the letter was a sudden upflashing desire to see her lover, to go out West and find him. Impulses with her were rather rare and inhibited, but this one made her tremble. If Glenn was well again, he must have vastly changed from the moody, stone-faced, and haunted-eyed man who had so worried and distressed her. He had embarrassed her, too, for sometimes in her home, meeting young men there who had not gone into the service. He had seemed to retreat into himself, singularly aloof, as if his world was not theirs. Again, with eager eyes and quivering lips, she read the letter. It contained words that lifted her heart. Her starved love greedily absorbed them. In them she had excuse for any resolve that might bring Glenn closer to her, and she pondered over this longing to go to him. Carley had the means to come and go and live as she liked. She did not remember her father, who had died when she was a child. Her mother had left her in the care of a sister, and before the war They had divided their time between New York and Europe, the Adirondacks and Florida. Carley had gone in for Red Cross and relief work with more of the sincerity than most of her set. But she was really not used to making any decision as definite and important as that of going out West alone. She had never been farther west than Jersey City, and her conception of the West was a hazy one of vast plains and rough mountains, squalid towns, cattle herds, and uncouth, ill-clad men. So she carried the letter to her aunt, a rather slight woman with a kindly face and shrewd eyes, and who appeared somewhat given to old-fashioned garments. "Aunt Mary, here's a letter from Glenn," said Carley. "It's more of a stumper than usual. Please read it." "Dear me, you look upset," replied the aunt mildly, and adjusting her spectacles, she took the letter. Carley waited impatiently for the perusal, conscious of inward forces coming more and more to the aid of her impulse to go west. Her aunt paused once to murmur how glad she was that Glenn had gotten well. Then she read on to the close. "Carley, that's a fine letter," she said fervently. "Do you see through it?" "No, I don't," replied Carley. "That's why I asked you to read it. Do you still love Glenn as you used to before?" "Why, Aunt Mary!" exclaimed Carley in surprise. "Excuse me, Carley, if I'm blunt, but the fact is young women of modern times are very different from my kind when I was a girl. You haven't acted as though you pined for Glenn. You gad around almost the same as ever." "What's a girl to do?" protested Carley. "You are 26 years old, Carley," retorted Aunt Mary. "Suppose I am. I'm as young as I ever was." "Well, let's not argue about modern girls and modern times. We never get anywhere," returned her aunt kindly. "But I can tell you something of what Glenn Kilbourne means in that letter, if you want to hear it." "I do indeed." "The war did something horrible to Glenn, aside from wrecking his health. Shell shock, they said. I don't understand that. Out of his mind, they said. But that never was true. Glenn was as sane as I am, and, my dear, that's pretty sane, I'll have you remember. But he must have suffered some terrible blight to his spirit, some blunting of his soul. For months after he returned he walked as one in a trance. Then came a change. He grew restless. Perhaps that change was for the better. At least it showed he had roused. Glenn saw you and your friends and the life you lead, and all the present, with the eyes from which the scales had dropped. He saw what was wrong. He never said so to me, but I knew it. It wasn't only to get well that he went West. It was to get away. And, Carley Burch, if your happiness depends on him, you had better be up and doing, or you'll lose him." "Aunt Mary!" gasped Carley. "I mean it. That letter shows how near he came to the valley of the shadow, and how he has become a man. If I were you, I'd go out West. Surely there must be a place where it would be all right for you to stay." "Oh, yes," replied Carley eagerly. "Glenn wrote me there was a lodge where people went in nice weather, right down in the canyon, not far from his place. Then, of course, the town, Flagstaff, isn't far. Aunt Mary, I think I'll go." "I would. You're certainly wasting your time here." "But I could only go for a visit," rejoined Carley thoughtfully. "A month, perhaps 6 weeks, if I could stand it." "Seems to me if you could stand New York you could stand that place," said Aunt Mary dryly. "The idea of staying away from New York any length of time! Why, I couldn't do it. But I can stay out there long enough to bring Glenn back with me." "It may take you longer than you think," replied her aunt, with a gleam in her shrewd eyes. "If you want my advice, you will surprise Glenn. Don't write him. Don't give him a chance to suggest courteously that you'd better not come just yet. I don't like his words, 'just yet.'" "Auntie, you're rather more than blunt," said Carley, divided between resentment and amaze. "Glenn would be simply wild to have me come." "Maybe he would. Has he ever asked you?" "No. Come to think of it, he hasn't," replied Carley reluctantly. "Aunt Mary, you hurt my feelings." "Well, child, I'm glad to learn your feelings are hurt," returned the aunt. "I'm sure, Carley, that underneath all this blase ultra something you've acquired, there's a real heart. Only you must hurry and listen to it, or—" "Or what?" queried Carley. Aunt Mary shook her gray head sagely. "Never mind what, Carley. I'd like your idea of the most significant thing in Glenn's letter. "Why, his love for me, of course," replied Carley. "Naturally you think that, but I don't. What struck me most were his words, 'out of the West.' Carley, you'd do well to ponder over them." "I will," rejoined Carley, positively. "I'll do more. I'll go out to his wonderful West and see what he meant by them." Chapter 1, Part 2. Carley Burch possessed in full degree the prevailing modern craze for speed. She loved a motor car ride at 60 miles an hour along a smooth, straight road, or better, on the level seashore of Ormond, where on moonlight nights the white blanched sand seemed to flash toward her. Therefore, quite to her taste was the 20th Century Limited, which was hurling her on her way to Chicago. The unceasing smooth and even rush of the train satisfied something in her. An old lady sitting in an adjoining seat with a companion amused Carley by the remark, "I wish we didn't go so fast. People nowadays haven't time to draw a comfortable breath. Suppose we should run off the track." Carley had no fear of express trains or motor cars or transatlantic liners. In fact, she prided herself in not being afraid of anything. But she wondered if this was not the false courage of association with a crowd. Before this enterprise at hand, she could not remember anything she had undertaken alone. Her thrills seemed to be in abeyance to the end of her journey. That night her sleep was permeated with the steady, low whirring of the wheels. Once roused by a jerk, she lay awake in the darkness, while the thought came to her that she and all her fellow passengers were really at the mercy of the engineer. Who was he, and did he stand at his throttle keen and vigilant, thinking of the lives entrusted to him? Such thoughts vaguely annoyed Carley, and she dismissed them. A long half-day wait in Chicago was a tedious preliminary to the second part of her journey. But at last she found herself aboard the California Limited, and went to bed with a relief quite a stranger to her. The glare of the sun under the curtain awakened her. Propped up on her pillows, she looked out at apparently endless green fields or pastures, dotted now and then with little farmhouses and tree-skirted villages. This country, she thought, must be the prairie land she remembered lay west of the Mississippi. Later, in the dining car, the steward smilingly answered her question. "This is Kansas, and those green fields out there are the wheat that feeds the nation." Carley was not impressed. The color of the short wheat appeared soft and rich, and the boundless fields stretched away monotonously. She had not known there was so much flat land in the world, and she imagined it might be a fine country for automobile roads. When she got back to her seat, she drew the blinds down and read her magazines. Then, tiring of that, she went back to the observation car. Carley was accustomed to attracting attention, and did not resent it unless she was annoyed. The train evidently had a full complement of passengers, who, as far as Carley could see, were people not of her station in life. The glare from the many windows and the rather crass interest of several men drove her back to her own section. There she discovered that someone had drawn up her window shades. Carley promptly pulled them down and settled herself comfortably. Then she heard a woman speak, not particularly low. "I thought people traveled west to see the country." And a man replied rather dryly, "Well, not always." His companion went on, "If that girl was mine I'd let down her skirt." The man laughed and replied, "Martha, you're sure behind the times. Look at the pictures in the magazines." Such remarks amused Carley, and later she took advantage of an opportunity to notice her neighbors. They appeared a rather quaint old couple, reminding her of the natives of the country towns in the Adirondacks. She was not amused, however, when another of her woman neighbors, speaking low, referred to her as a lunger. Carley appreciated the fact that she was pale, but she assured herself that there ended any possible resemblance she might have to a consumptive. And she was somewhat pleased to hear this woman's male companion forcibly voice her own convictions. In fact, he was nothing if not admiring. Kansas was interminably long to Carley, and she went to sleep before riding out of it. Next morning she found herself looking out at the rough gray and black land of New Mexico. She searched the horizon for mountains, and there did not appear to be any. She received a vague, slow dawning impression that was hard to define. She did not like the country, though that was not the impression which eluded her. Bare, gray flats, low, scrub-fringed hills, bleak cliffs, jumble after jumble of rocks, and occasionally a long vista down a valley, somehow compelling, these passed before her gaze until she tired of them. Where was the West Glenn had written about? One thing seemed sure, and it was that every mile of this crude country brought her nearer to him. This recurring thought gave Carley all the pleasure she had felt so far in this endless ride. It struck her that England or France could be dropped down into New Mexico and scarcely noticed. By and by the sun grew hot. The train wound slowly and creakingly up grade. The car became full of dust, all which was disagreeable to Carley. She dozed on her pillow for hours, until she was stirred by a passenger crying out delightedly, "Look! Indians!" Carley looked, not without interest. As a child she had read about Indians, and memory returned images both colorful and romantic. From the car window she espied dusty flat barrens, low squat mud houses, and queer-looking little people, children naked or extremely ragged and dirty, women in loose garments with flares of red, and men in white man's garb, slovenly and motley. All these strange individuals stared apathetically as the train slowly passed. "Indians," muttered Carley, incredulously. "Well, if they are the noble red people, my illusions are dispelled." She did not look out the window again, not even when the brakeman called out the remarkable name of Albuquerque. Next day Carley's languid attention quickened to the name of Arizona, and to the frowning red walls of rock, and to the vast rolling stretches of cedar-dotted land. Nevertheless, it affronted her. This was no country for people to live in. So far as she could see, it was indeed uninhabited. Her sensations were not, however, limited to sight. She became aware of unfamiliar disturbing little shocks or vibrations in her eardrums, and after that a disagreeable bleeding of the nose. The porter told her this was owing to the altitude. Thus, one thing and another kept Carley most of the time away from the window, so that she really saw very little of the country. From what she had seen she drew the conviction that she had not missed much. At sunset she deliberately gazed out to discover what an Arizona sunset was like, just a pale yellow flare. She had seen better than that above the Palisades. Not until reaching Winslow did she realize how near she was to her journey's end, and that she would arrive at Flagstaff after dark. She grew conscious of nervousness. Suppose Flagstaff were like these other queer little towns. Not only once, but several times before the train slowed down for her destination, did Carley wish she had sent Glenn word to meet her. And when presently she found herself standing out in the dark, cold, windy night before a dim-lit railroad station, she more than regretted her decision to surprise Glenn. But that was too late, and she must make the best of her poor judgment. Men were passing to and fro on the platform, some of whom appeared to be very dark of skin and eye, and were probably Mexicans. At length an expressman approached Carley, soliciting patronage. He took her bags, and depositing them in a wagon, he pointed up the wide street. "1 block up and turn. Hotel Weatherford." Then he drove off. Carley followed, carrying her small satchel. A cold wind, driving the dust, stung her face as she crossed the street to a high sidewalk that extended along the block. There were lights in the stores and on the corners, yet she seemed impressed by a dark, cold, windy bigness. Many people, mostly men, were passing up and down, and there were motor cars everywhere. No one paid any attention to her. Gaining the corner of the block, she turned and was relieved to see the hotel sign. As she entered the lobby, a clicking of pool balls and the discordant rasp of a phonograph assailed her ears. The expressman set down her bags and left Carley standing there. The clerk or proprietor was talking from behind his desk to several men, and they were loungers in the lobby. The air was thick with tobacco smoke. No one paid any attention to Carley until at length she stepped up to the desk and interrupted the conversation there. "Is this a hotel?" she queried brusquely. The shirt-sleeved individual leisurely turned and replied, "Yes, ma'am." And Carley said, "No one would recognize it by the courtesy shown. I have been standing here waiting to register." With the same leisurely case and a cool, laconic stare, the clerk turned the book toward her. "Reckon people around here ask for what they want." Carley made no further comment. She assuredly recognized that what she had been accustomed to could not be expected out here. What she most wished to do at the moment was to get close to that big open grate where a cheery red and gold fire cracked. It was necessary, however, to follow the clerk. He assigned her to a small drab room which contained a bed, a bureau, and a stationary washstand with one spigot. There was also a chair. Carley removed her coat and hat. The clerk went downstairs for the rest of her luggage. Upon his return, Carley learned that a stage left the hotel for Oak Creek Canyon at 9 o'clock next morning. And this cheered her so much that she faced a strange sense of loneliness and discomfort with something of fortitude. There was no heat in the room and no hot water. When Carley squeezed the spigot handle there burst forth a torrent of water that spouted up out of the wash basin to deluge her. It was colder than any ice water she had ever felt. It was piercingly cold. Hard upon the surprise and shock, Carley suffered a flash of temper. But then the humor of it struck her, and she had to laugh. "Serves you right, you spoiled doll of luxury," she mocked. "This is out West. Shiver and wait on yourself." Never before had she undressed so swiftly nor felt so grateful for thick woolen blankets on a hard bed. Gradually she grew warm. The blackness, too, seemed rather comforting. "I'm only 20 miles from Glenn," she whispered. "How strange! I wonder will he be glad?" She felt a sweet, glowing assurance of that. Sleep did not come readily. Excitement had laid hold of her nerves, and for a long time she lay awake. After a while the chug of motor cars, the click of pool balls, the murmur of low voices, all ceased. Then she heard a sound of wind outside, an intermittent, low moaning, new to her ears and somehow pleasant. Another sound greeted her, the musical clanging of a clock that struck the quarters of the hour. Some time late sleep claimed her. Upon awakening she found she had overslept, necessitating haste upon her part. And to that the temperature of the room did not admit of leisurely dressing. She had no adequate name for the feeling of the water, and her fingers grew so numb that she made what she considered a disgraceful matter of her attire. Downstairs in the lobby another cheerful red fire burned in the grate. How perfectly satisfying was an open fireplace! She thrust her numb hands almost into the blaze and simply shook with the tingling pain that slowly warmed out of them. The lobby was deserted. A sign directed her to a dining room in the basement, where of the ham and eggs and strong coffee she managed to partake a little. Then she went upstairs into the lobby and out into the street. A cold, piercing air seemed to blow right through her. Walking to the near corner, she paused to look around. Down the main street flowed a leisurely stream of pedestrians, horses, cars, extending between two blocks of low buildings. Across from where she stood lay a vacant lot, beyond which began a line of neat, oddly constructed houses, evidently residences of the town. And then, lifting her gaze, instinctively drawn by something obstructing the skyline, she was suddenly struck with surprise and delight. "Oh, how perfectly splendid!" she burst out. Two magnificent mountains loomed right over her, sloping up with majestic sweep of green and black timber to a ragged, tree-fringed snow area that swept up clearer and whiter, at last to lift pure glistening peaks, noble and sharp, and sunrise flushed against the blue. Carley had climbed Mont Blanc and she had seen the Matterhorn, but they had never struck such amaze and admiration from her as these twin peaks of her native land. "What mountains are those?" she asked a passer-by. "San Francisco Peaks, ma'am," replied the man. "Why, they can't be over a mile away," she said. 18 miles, ma'am," he returned with a grin. "Shore this Arizona air is deceivin'." "How strange," murmured Carley. "It's not that way in the Adirondacks." She was still gazing upward when a man approached her and said the stage for Oak Creek Canyon would soon be ready to start, and he wanted to know if her baggage was ready. Carley hurried back to her room to pack. She had expected the stage would be a motor bus or at least a large touring car, but it turned out to be a two-seated vehicle drawn by a team of ragged horses. The driver was a little wizen-faced man of doubtful years, and he did not appear obviously susceptible to the importance of his passenger. There was considerable freight to be hauled beside Carley's luggage, but evidently she was the only passenger. "Reckon it's going to be a bad day," said the driver. "These April days high up in the desert are windy and cold. Maybe it'll snow, too. Them clouds hanging around the peaks ain't very promising. Now, miss, haven't you a heavier coat or something?" "No, I have not," replied Carley. "I'll have to stand it. Did you say this was desert?" "I sure did." "Well, there's a horse blanket under the seat, and you can have that," he replied, and climbing to the seat in front of Carley, he took up the reins and started the horses off at a trot. At the first turning Carley became specifically acquainted with the driver's meaning of a bad day. A gust of wind, raw and penetrating, laden with dust and stinging sand, swept full in her face. It came so suddenly that she was scarcely quick enough to close her eyes. It took considerable clumsy effort on her part, with a handkerchief, aided by relieving tears, to clear her sight again. Thus uncomfortably Carley found herself launched on the last lap of her journey. And before her and alongside lay the squalid environs of the town. Looked back at, with the peaks rising behind, it was not unpicturesque. But the hard road with its sheets of flying dust, the bleak railroad yards, the round pens she took for cattle corrals, and the sordid debris littering the approach to a huge sawmill, these were offensive in Carley's sight. From a tall dome-like stack rose a yellowish smoke that spread overhead, adding to the lowering aspect of the sky. Beyond the sawmill extended the open country, sloping somewhat roughly, and evidently once a forest, but now a hideous bare slash, with ghastly burned stems of trees still standing and myriads of stumps attesting to denudation. The bleak road wound away to the southwest, and from this direction came the gusty wind. It did not blow regularly so that Carley could be on her guard. It lulled now and then, permitting her to look about, and then suddenly again whipping dust into her face. The smell of the dust was as unpleasant as the sting. It made her nostrils smart. It was penetrating, and a little more of it would have been suffocating. And as a leaden gray bank of broken clouds rolled up, the wind grew stronger and the air colder. Chilled before, Carley now became thoroughly cold. There appeared to be no end to the devastated forest land, and the farther she rode, the more barren and sordid grew the landscape. Carley forgot about the impressive mountains behind her, and as the ride wore into hours, such was her discomfort and disillusion that she forgot about Glenn Kilbourne. She did not reach the point of regretting her adventure, but she grew mightily unhappy. Now and then she espied dilapidated log cabins and surroundings even more squalid than the ruined forest. What wretched abodes! Could it be possible that people had lived in them? She imagined men, but hardly women and children. Somewhere she had forgotten an idea that women and children were extremely scarce in the West. Straggling bits of forest, yellow pines the driver called the trees, began to encroach upon the burned-over and arid, barren land. To Carley, these groves, by reason of contrast and proof of what once was, only rendered the landscape more forlorn and dreary. Why had these miles and miles of forest been cut? By money grubbers, she supposed, the same as were devastating the Adirondacks. Presently, when the driver had to halt to repair or adjust something wrong with the harness, Carley was grateful for a respite from cold inaction. She got out and walked. Sleep began to fall, and when she resumed her seat in the vehicle she asked the driver for the blanket to cover her. The smell of this horse blanket was less endurable than the cold. Carley huddled down into a state of apathetic misery. Already she had enough of the West. But the sleet storm passed, the clouds broke, the sun shone through, greatly mitigating her discomfort. By and by the road led into a section of real forest, unspoiled in any degree. Carley saw large gray squirrels with tufted ears and white bushy tails. Presently the driver pointed out a flock of huge birds, which Carley, on second glance, recognized as turkeys, only these were sleek and glossy, with flecks of bronze and black and white, quite different from turkeys back east. "There must be a farm near," said Carley, gazing about. "No, ma'am. Them's wild turkeys," replied the driver, "and sure the best eatin' you ever had in your life." A little while afterwards, as they were emerging from the woodland into more denuded country, he pointed out to Carley a herd of gray white rumped animals that she took to be sheep. "And them's antelope," he said. "Once this desert was overrun by antelope. Then they nearly disappeared, and now they're increasing again." More barren country, more bad weather, and especially an exceedingly rough road reduced Carley to her former state of dejection. The jolting over roots and rocks and ruts was worse than uncomfortable. She had to hold on to the seat to keep from being thrown out. The horses did not appreciably change their gait for rough sections of the road. Then a more severe jolt brought Carley's knee in violent contact with an iron bolt on the forward seat, and it hurt her so acutely that she had to bite her lips to keep from screaming. A smoother stretch of road did not come any too soon for her. It led into forest again, and Carley soon became aware that they had at last left the cut and burned over district of timberland behind. A cold wind moaned through the tree tops and set drops of water pattering down upon her. It lashed her wet face. Carley closed her eyes and sagged in her seat, mostly oblivious to the passing scenery. "The girls will never believe this of me," she soliloquized, and indeed she was amazed at herself. Then thought of Glenn strengthened her. It did not really matter what she suffered on the way to him. Only she was disgusted at her lack of stamina and her appalling sensitiveness to discomfort. "Well, here's Oak Canyon Creek," called the driver. Carley, rousing out of her weary preoccupation, opened her eyes to see that the driver had halted at a turn of the road, where apparently it descended a fearful declivity. The very forest-fringed earth seemed to have opened into a deep abyss, ribbed by red rock walls and choked by steep mats of green timber. The chasm was a V-shaped split, and so deep that looking downward sent at once a chill and shudder over Carley. At that point it appeared narrow and had ended in a box. In the other direction it widened and deepened, and stretched farther on between tremendous walls of red, and split its winding floor of green with glimpses of a gleaming creek, boulder-strewn and ridged by white rapids. A low, mellow roar of rushing water floated up to Carley's ears. What a wild, lonely, terrible place! Could Glenn possibly live down there in that ragged rent in the earth? It frightened her, the sheer sudden plunge of it from the heights. Far down the gorge a purple light shone on the forested floor, and on the moment the sun burst through the clouds and sent a golden blaze down into the depths, transforming them incalculably. The great cliffs turned gold, the creek changed to glancing silver, the green of trees vividly freshened, and in the clefts rays of sunlight burned into the blue shadows. Carley had never gazed upon a scene like this. Hostile and prejudiced, yet she felt wrung from an acknowledgment of beauty and grandeur. But wild, violent, savage, not livable, this insulated rift in the crust of the earth was a gigantic burrow for beasts, perhaps for outlawed men, not for a civilized person, not for Glenn Kilbourne. "Don't be scared, ma'am," spoke up the driver. "It's safe if you're careful, and I've drove this many the time." Carley's heartbeats thumped at her side, rather denying her taunted assurance of fearlessness. The rickety vehicle started down at an angle that forced her to cling to her seat. End of chapter 1, part 2.